We could all look back at Paul's ministry and see the fruitfulness of it, the effect of it, even recognizing that 2,000 odd years today, we're sitting here changed by it. We would not be talking about this if it weren't for Paul writing this thank you note to the church in Philippi for their generosity. We wouldn't be sitting here if Paul hadn't been called by God and responded to that call. And I think many of us compare ourselves to Paul and say, wow, well, I'm trying my best, but I'm not like Paul. I couldn't do that. And I think often we get confused when we see this, and we have to understand the perspective that Paul did things from. I want to point out 3 things that I think Paul views differently than the world does. 3 things that we should view differently than the world does today. The first of those is suffering. I figured we'd get the not fun to talk about one over with. It's our favorite topic, right? Let's talk about suffering. But we see here in Philippians 1, Paul has an incredibly unique perspective on suffering. He is in prison, wrongfully so. If you remember all the way back to Acts chapter 20, he's accused of taking a Gentile into the temple, so the Jews arrest him. And all the way along, he keeps going from judge to judge to judge, and they're trying to decide what to do with him. And finally, he appeals to Caesar because he's afraid that the Jews are going to kill him. And he ends up getting taken to Rome and waiting there in prison. All of this, the point that he is at, is all because someone wrongfully accused him. But he's here saying in verse 12, I want you to know that this happened, and it's really served to advance the gospel. It's like, this was actually a good thing, you guys. Just don't be bummed out that I'm here because God is using it. Paul is suffering. Paul is going through really difficult circumstances, but he says the gospel is being advanced. People are getting saved. People are hearing about Jesus. He says even the whole imperial guard has now heard the gospel. And maybe you could picture Paul sitting there in prison, and often then you had to be chained directly to a guard because they really were worried about him escaping. And so he'd be chained to a guard and say, oh, I have a captive audience. You can't go anywhere for the next however long your shift is. And he'd just tell them, so why are you here? You're not a murderer. You're not some dangerous person. Well, I was preaching about Jesus. Really? Tell me, who's Jesus? Well, let me tell you. And then a few hours later, a new guard comes in. And it starts all over again. And now all of the guard has heard about Jesus. Lives are being changed that would probably never be reached if Paul weren't in that prison. He says not only are the guards being reached, but the Christians are being emboldened in their faith. Because they see Paul in prison and think, oh, well, he preached and he went to prison and he's still preaching and God is still using him. Okay, maybe it's not that bad. Maybe God could work through this. Maybe I don't need to be afraid of this quite as much as I thought I did. They're being emboldened in their faith. And he says even the body is involved. Down in verse 19, he says that he knows that through their prayers, he'll be delivered. He says that they're praying for him now, so the body has been able to get involved in this difficult thing, and it's involving the whole Christian community in a way that's building everyone up. Paul is in a hard circumstance, and that's the nearsighted side of it, that we'd be foolish to say, no, Paul is just living it up. Like, this is Paul's goal. He wanted to get in prison. And if we only had the far-sighted side of things, we might say, oh yeah, well, it's all good. The nearsighted is true, though. He's in prison. He is in a hard place. There is no denying that. But Paul has the perspective to see both sides and say, yeah, this sucks, but God's using it. This isn't where I thought I would be, but God's using it. This isn't how I planned it would go. As we sung, I thought by now these walls would have fallen down, a reference back to Jericho. You remember they're walking silently around the city because God said he delivered into their hands. And thinking, what good is this going to do? Paul in prison thinking, what good is this going to do? I thought I was supposed to preach the gospel to the world. And it would have been so easy for him to get hung up on that and say, wow, I guess when this hard circumstance changes, I could do something. But because he has this perspective that God could use the suffering in his life, he says, while I'm here, I'll see what God can do. While I'm in the middle of this, I'll let God use me, not when I get past it. I think this even ties back, as I was reading this chapter, I was reminded of Acts chapter 16, where Paul met the Philippians. And I wonder if this is how this letter even came about a little bit, where he's sitting in prison and he's remembering I'm in prison. This is familiar. Oh yeah, I was in prison in Philippi. Maybe I should write to them and encourage them. And many of us might have written a passive-aggressive thing saying, hey, remember when you locked me up and beat me and imprisoned me? It's happening again, and I wanted you to know I was thinking of you. But that's not what he does, because he has a different perspective that we could even see in Acts chapter 16. Do you remember? He shows up in Philippi because God told him to go there through a dream. And people are starting to get saved. Lydia at the river gets saved, and the church is growing, and they cast a demon out of a little girl. But this little girl was a slave, and they were using this demon that was living in her for some divination, for like fortune-telling type things. And they get really mad because now their prophet is gone. They're not going to make any money off of this anymore. And so they drag Paul and Silas into the town center. They say, these Jews that are here are stirring up trouble. Prejudice already because of their race. And they beat them. They beat them with sticks and with rods, and they throw them in prison, all because they cast the demon out of a little girl. And it says at midnight, Paul and Silas, who are in the stocks now, you know, in the movies when you see them in the wooden thing with their arms in it, they're in those now, humiliated, beaten probably within an inch of their life. They're tired, they're hungry, they're cold. It says their clothes have been taken. They've been treated so unfairly. They did a good thing. They did what we would hope someone would do in that situation. They liberated someone. But the turn of events has come against them at every turn. I think we learn so much about ourselves when we're treated unfairly, when things don't go how we expected them to for us. It says that there at midnight, they were praying and singing hymns to God. Their perspective in the middle of this was, wow, this sucks. But God's good. This isn't where I wanted to be, but God loves me. He's faithful. And through this, it says that as they were singing, as they were praying, there was a great earthquake and all the prison doors opened. And the guard, thinking that they've all escaped, is going to kill himself because he would be killed for letting them escape. And Paul cries out, don't kill yourself. And they come to him and they say, okay, what do we need to do to be saved? And we could read this story as just, wow, that's such a beautiful picture, but I want to point something out. How did the guard know to go to Paul? How did the guard know that Paul was the one that could help him with this? Other than how he watched him walk through unfair circumstances, difficult situations. Do you know, church, that the way you handle suffering is a light for Christ? That the world sees it. They see only the near side. So they say, wow, they're walking through something that's horrible. That isn't fair for them. They shouldn't have to do that. But we have the advantage and the perspective to see beyond that circumstance and say, yeah, but God's at work. Yeah, but God's going to do something. He's going to show up. And not only are there the things that he'll work through it in the other people around us, the opportunities that he brings. I want to point you to the end of this chapter. In verses 29 and 30, he says, it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ, you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. That word granted is the word grace. It has been graced to you. It was a gift. You didn't earn it. You didn't deserve it. But God said that he wanted to give it to you as a gift. I thought of a grant like when you hear about people getting research grants where they want to go and study this and learn more about this thing. And so they're given money and they're given time to go and do this. And that's what suffering is for us, church. We have this grant to go and learn and to study and to grow in. The Bible tells us that suffering produces patience, produces character. It produces endurance in us. It produces hope, it says, ultimately. And that hope doesn't put us to shame. So there's these opportunities that God is going to bring from our suffering. But there's also these things he wants to build in us through our suffering. Maybe you've experienced it. There's no way to get better at patience without dealing with circumstances that make you want to be impatient. It's not like we can be, God, just make me patient. And he zaps and all of a sudden you're patient. It's walking through repeatedly difficult circumstances. Maybe some of you, as we sing the songs we sang today of God's faithfulness, the seasons that you weren't sure if he would come through have made those songs so much more true to you. because the suffering and the difficulty and the endurance along the way proved it. It's one thing to sing it and say, yeah, I'm sure that's true. But when we've seen it in our lives, it changes it, where we can say, yeah, I know. It's no longer this thing I've heard or been told, I've experienced it. And I think God allows us to walk through some difficult things so that we can experience it with him. So that we can know that he's good. So that we can know that he's with us. He goes from there in verse 30 to say that we're engaged in the same conflict that Paul is in, that Christ is in. And it brings me to the second perspective shift, the second thing I think Paul sees differently that we should look at. Opposition. I told you, I got lots of fun ones for us today, huh? Suffering, opposition. Come back next week, please. But Paul views opposition differently. Maybe the world around us would say, no, like we're in America, we haven't been invaded, we haven't been attacked. But with our spiritual perspective, we'd say, hey, we have an enemy. The first thing Paul says is that they're in a battle. He tells them to stand firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. It's interesting to me that he doesn't say, oh, by the way, you have an enemy. He expects them to know that. The first thing I think of Paul's perspective on opposition is that it's there. We have to recognize, church, we're in a battle. Church, we have an enemy. I was reading a book about some Navy SEALs recently, and I love just wars and all those stories about the different acts of heroism. And something that struck me in when I was recently reading is they were stateside and they were getting ready to be deployed. And the author was talking about the difficulty in that season of the in-between, where they're not out in the battlefield, but they're not really home anymore either, and saying how they have to be careful what they say. They have to be careful who they tell where they're going and what they tell about what they'll be doing. If they get a call, they say, yeah, I'm going to work. That's really all they could say about it. And it struck me that this was interesting because they're not face-to-face with a guy with a gun at this point, but they're recognizing there's a target on their back. They need to have caution. They need to be paying attention. In church, we have to remember there's a target on our backs. We are in a battle. I think from what Paul encourages the Philippians, we can see two things that the enemy is after, too. We can learn his targets and beat him to them. First, he's after our unity. That's why Paul tells them, see that you're standing firm with one spirit. He says, protect your unity. Strive side by side for the faith of the gospel. It's the ultimate strategy, right? Divide and conquer. Our unity points to Christ. Our unity is part of our power, as Zach was saying last week. We have to stand together. We have to defend our unity. And that's why it's so important for us to work out the things we have between each other. Why Paul will, even in a few chapters, tell these two women to get along, to agree in the Lord, to take the time to say, hey, this isn't right. Let's sit down. Let's fix it. Let's become unified again. And so often we want to point to the other person, don't we? And so, well, yeah, but they fill in the blank. To the Romans, he wrote, as far as you're able, be at peace with everyone. As much as it depends on you, as far as you can go with it, be at peace with them. Do we take that seriously? Not as far as is comfortable, not as far as you're willing to go in front of people, not until it seems kind of embarrassing for you to talk to them, not as far as your pride allows, as far as you're able. Jesus would even say, if you have something against your brother and you're coming to church and you realize that things aren't right and that you've caused this rift, that you should go to them before you come to church. He said it'd be better to be late to church than to be divided with a brother or a sister. But I don't think we take that seriously. What would that look like if we took the time to mend the unity, to maintain the unity? Secondly, he's after our message. Which is why Paul gets into this, I think, in verse 28. He says, don't be frightened in anything by your opponents. That's a new perspective for us, isn't it? You have an enemy. You are under attack. Our first thought is duck and cover. Get out of harm's way. But Paul says, don't be scared. Don't be afraid. Because you already won. The battle is already over. The enemy is using fear as a tactic to keep us from speaking out, to keep us from showing God's love, from sharing his truth. But Paul reminds us we don't have to be afraid of our enemy because our enemy has been defeated. He's doing damage control now, trying to keep us from getting any more ground. But he's on the run. God won that victory on the cross. We need to have this perspective that the battle is won. That God is with us. Do you remember in the Old Testament, Elisha's house is surrounded by the enemy? And Elisha goes and looks outside. I was like, all right, no big deal. And it says his servant looks outside and sees the enemy. He's like, what do you mean no big deal, Elisha? They're all around us. We're going to die. And I love Elisha's response. He's like, oh, God didn't open your eyes yet. Like, what? No. God I opened my eyes. I saw the enemy is everywhere. And I think some Christians live that way. That we're so caught up in the danger of the world around us, in the fear of the power that the enemy has, that we cower and we stand back and say, I don't know if I could go out there because it's terrifying and I saw how much the enemy is there. But Elisha prayed for his servant. He said, God, open his eyes. And he looked again. He saw on every hill around them the armies of the Lord, hosts of angels gathered. He said, oh, okay. I guess we are going to win. And that's the perspective shift that we need, that our eyes would be opened to the things that God's doing, to the power that he has, that we wouldn't get caught up or sidetracked in the ability of the enemy, because the enemy already lost. He showed all his cards, and it ended for him. Jesus went to the cross, he died, and he rose again. Colossians says, triumphing over him, shaming him openly. He embarrassed him with how much he won by. There was no chance. It wasn't even a fair fight. We have the victory. And the third thing where I want to leave you guys today to consider as we go from here is Paul's perspective on eternity. Maybe one of the most famous verses that Paul has ever penned here in this chapter, verse 21, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. And this sounds beautiful, doesn't it? That's like poetry from Paul. If he wrote a poetry book, this would definitely be in it. To live is Christ and to die is gain. That's like a bumper sticker. But what if we stopped and broke that down a little bit? What if we even separated one from each other? It's a big thing to say to live is Christ. To say, if I'm here, it's because Jesus wants me here to accomplish his will, and that is my perspective, that is my focus, that is my aim. We say, wow, that is intense. Not to live is to be successful or happy or to get the promotion or the house or the car. To live is Christ. He says, I'm here for whatever Jesus wants me here for however long Jesus wants me to be here for. That's a hard thing to wrap our minds around. But I think we're given some perspective again in the other half of the phrase. He says, to die is gain. And for me, as I was studying this week, that was the one that really blew me away. Not to live is Christ. We could understand that because Paul's like a super Christian. Of course he would say this. But talk about a perspective shift for us to say to die is gain. So if the worst thing happened, that would actually be the best thing. He goes on in the next couple verses to say that for him to depart to be with Christ would be far better. He has his hope set on eternity. He has his eyes set there. He can't wait to get to heaven and be with Jesus. And I think we need this perspective. And this isn't to say that we become farsighted and forget the things going on. But if we lose the sight of that hope, and we get caught up in the things around us and get entangled by all these things that slow us down, we miss out on what he's doing. We struggle to walk it out. This perspective is what gives us the power and the strength to continue. Because when we get to heaven, there won't be suffering anymore. We won't need a perspective of it because it'll be over. The opposition will finally be put to rest at that point. It says that all tears are gone, all pain is gone. Every struggle that we're facing here will be over. We'll be in the presence of God. I think one of the greatest things the enemy has done in the fight against us is make us bored by the thought of heaven. You ever think about that? We think about heaven and we're like, oh, clouds and harps and little baby angels. I really hope that's not what heaven's like, and I don't see any picture in the Bible of heaven looking like that. I love a passage in Revelation at the end that talks about this new Jerusalem coming down from the clouds, and he measures it. And do you realize how big it is? It's 1,400 miles in every direction, the city. And it says the gates are open, and some lead that to believe that we could come in and out of the city. It's 1,400 miles tall. I did the math on it at one point because I was just trying to wrap my mind around it. Let's say there's a floor at every level. 1,400 floors. That's a lot already. If that's the case, 1,400-mile cube with 1,400 floors, a foot every mile, every Christian to have ever existed would have their own space the size of Texas. This isn't going to be something where we get there and they're like, okay, here's your diaper, here's your harp, here's your cloud, go sit down somewhere. We're going to be with Jesus face to face. Imagine all the questions we could ask. It's like, Jesus, wait, when this happened, why did you say that to them? Why did you handle this way? What was it like? Heaven is going to be amazing. Paul recognizes that to be in heaven will be far better. But the other side of this, to live is Christ. Do you recognize here, we would often call dying for someone, dying the greatest sacrifice you could make. And I don't want to diminish that. But here, what Paul says, he says, I would so much rather go be with Jesus, but I guess for you guys, I'll make the sacrifice to live. He flips it. He says the sacrifice is to not die. He says, I'm staying here because it's necessary. He would rather die. He would rather go be with Jesus because he sees how much better that will be. But he says, for you, for the people around me that still need to hear, for the people in my life that I could still encourage, that I could still show the love of God to. He's writing to a church and he says to them, the people around him that he could impact, the lives he could touch, he says, it's better for me to stay. And I wonder if we have that perspective of our lives. In Romans 12, chapter 1, he tells us to present ourselves as a living sacrifice. It'd be greater to go be with him in heaven. But he says here, to live for the people around us, to make that sacrifice, to live sacrificially for the world, just as Jesus did. I think that only becomes possible when we have this hope of heaven. I don't think we could ever say to live is Christ if we don't know that to die is gain. Church, we need this perspective. We can only get it from Jesus. Paul will go on in this chapter to point right to Jesus and say, look at how he did it. Look at the mind that he had. He is our example in this. He's the forerunner ahead of us in this. And I'm encouraged that we're not walking alone in it as we consider these things. In a moment, I want to pray with you, but before I do that, we couldn't talk about our hope of heaven. We couldn't talk about the battle that's been won without being reminded of the cross. And maybe there are some here today that have never experienced that relationship with Jesus. Your perspective is limited. You say, I don't know about these spiritual things. I'm not so sure. Or even as I'm speaking on it, your heart is tugging toward it. saying, yeah, I want that hope, a hope that what's coming next is better than what we have now. That sounds great. Let me tell you today that 2,000 years ago, Jesus came. He lived here on this earth, a sinless life. He went to the cross. He died in your place, in my place. It says that everything we'd ever done, all of our sin, all of our guilt, all of our shame was laid on him when he was on that cross. He wasn't up there because of his own crimes. He was up there because of ours. And while he was there, he paid for everything we've ever done wrong. Past, present, future. Every sin in the world he took and he paid for. All so that we could have relationship with him. So that we could be invited into his family. And you might say, wow, okay, that sounds like there's probably a pretty big thing to reach to get that. It's free though. He wants us to have this, all because he loved us so much. Not because we needed to earn it, but because he knew we could never earn it. So he came, and in his love for us, died in our place and rose again 3 days later to prove it, to show that we could have this life, to give us this new perspective, this new way of living. But it's an invitation that we need to receive. And so I want to put this out there to you today. If you've never received that invitation, if you've never given your life to Jesus, if you haven't begun a relationship with him, it'll change everything. It'll give you a whole new perspective. You'll have hope of heaven when you die. You'll have the power of him living with you every moment. You'll have forgiveness, the guilt and the shame and the condemnation that we feel is removed. But we have to respond by faith. We have to receive this work that he's done. So I want to ask you today, is there anybody here that needs to do that? You're saying, yeah, that's me. If that's you, I want you to just put your hand up right where you're at. And I get it if you are scared out of your mind and you feel the pressure. This is heavy. This is hard. This is nerve-wracking. It might feel like everyone's looking at you. It might feel like I'm talking right to you. I don't know who you are. I don't know what's going on in your life. But I know that Jesus does. He loves you. He's calling you into a relationship with him. Will you turn to him? If that's you, I want you to just put your hand up right where you're at. It's the best decision you could ever make. Is there someone up? That's awesome, man. I'm so glad. Thank you. I'm proud of you. That's awesome. Is there anybody else? We're here to celebrate it with you, to rejoice in that new life in Christ. Maybe you're wrestling. I can remember a few months ago sitting with a junior high student. I've told some of you this already. And he said, I think I need to give my life to Jesus. And I said, okay, well, let's do it. And he said, maybe next week. And I said, okay, that's fine. We can do this whenever you want. There's no wrong time to do it. But I challenged him a little. I said, well, why not now? What's keeping you from right now? And he thought about it for a minute. He said, okay, now is good. And we laugh and we joke about it, but I think it points something out to us that we're making up some things in our head that are keeping us from it. We're trying to talk ourselves out of what we know God is calling us to. And so if that's you, let go of the excuses. Why not now? If there's anyone else here, just put your hand up. We'll celebrate that with you.